we've kind of started talking about the ego, and that's something that you speak about on YouTube quite a bit. And I found it extremely helpful with my journey and understanding this. I guess for me, something especially in the last year, as I've gone, deeper and deeper, and everything becomes more and more nuanced um, not like there's this process of differentiation between like, yeah, self and small self or non-self and oneness. But then there's also like mind and ego, and then there's body and heart and somatic ego within the soma. And so now I have this like working model of like, all of these different parts that have like differentiated. My hope is one day they come back together into this like integrated wholeness as that sort of like um that just awareness essentially. Um but I think like it's really interesting to hear your perspective on, maybe the mind ego and the somatic ego. Because that there's you have at least one specific video
Yes,
that's in the title, and I've listened to it at least 4 or 5 times because it was one of the things that just like hit me like so clearly, and I had never heard of before, and it's like become a big part of my understanding. And when I'm, working with others as well, like something I talk about, and I just think it's really interesting because, yeah, I just had never heard of it, and it really helped things click and helped with this differentiation. And when I'm sort of in my self, capital S awareness, I can be with the somatic ego. And I also find like the somatic ego and the sort of mind ego almost like play off each other
they do.
with like felt experience, then that manifests in the mind, or the mind can like have some thought and be triggered, and then the somatic ego can activate. And it's like this inner tug of war between these parts that, they're wounded parts essentially that typically for most people are kind of running the show and really should be in a much more assistant secondary role.
Right. Absolutely. Yeah, so I can go into that a bit. So people are usually familiar with the ego being somewhat of a psychological thing. And I do have a video that goes into the difference between mind and ego because a lot of teachers will conflate those two terms. And that's perfectly okay when teaching beginners. That once you get to a place beyond that, you want to differentiate those two terms. So I'm going to do that first if I can, and then I'll go into psychological versus somatic ego. So mind is just this parrot and it's going to just repeat whatever it's being programmed with. And so normally it's just like 2 plus 2 is 4. I got to make a left turn. I got to go to the bank. I got to assemble a chair. What's the tip for the waitress? There's no drama with it. It's just a machine. It's a tool that helps us. And the ego's like, what does that mean about me? And it's all about identification, desire, attachment, aversion, resistance. So when the mind is paying attention to ego, it's going to believe it. And it's going to have, it's going to just parrot that stuff out. And then that's going to cause emotions to arise in the body. And when we are training the mind with what is actually true through logic, through self inquiry, through discernment, then the mind becomes wise enough where it stops believing ego. It's like you walk down the same road every day, but on the corner, some guy robs you every day. Are you going to keep going down that path or are you going to take another path? So the mind's like, every time I listen to this guy, he robs me. So, I'm going to turn my attention away. And that will be the wisdom of mind, where mind can get so wise that it doesn't feed this ego with its attention. Ego starts to shrink.
Mhm.
But now let me get into so that's the difference. I guess that is the definition more of the psychological ego. So that's one arm of the ego that we're talking about.
Mhm.
The second arm is the somatic ego. So when we have a belief, so if I think, oh my gosh, I'm unsafe, I'm unsafe, I'm unsafe, well, I'm going to start feeling the anxiety of that in my body as a physical sensation. And then in the next moment, like, no, 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 actually, I'm safe, I'm safe, I'm safe. I got a new piece of information and now I'm safe. Oh, I immediately feel the difference physically. So that is the part of our somatic ego, the felt sense experience, but that felt sense experience feels like me. So see, the ego is all about identification, right? So
Mhm.
psychologically, I'm thinking I am these thoughts about how I'm not enough or how the world is scary. That's psychological ego versus functional thoughts of mind. "Ah, I got to just walk up the steps, you know? And so with the body, the felt sense, I'm feeling sad. Oh, I'm a sad person. That's who I am. That's my identity. I've always been like this. I'll always be like that. So all these stories can extrapolate off of this temporary experience. And even if an experience feels like it's chronic, you can think of even chronic pain. It's not always the same intensity every single second. It doesn't always have the same duration every single day. There are fluctuations in it, and we have to notice that. There are fluctuations in all of our experiences. So when I have a felt sense emotion, and I think that's who I am, that's somatic ego. That's my identification with my emotional experience. But then you can break up somatic ego into 2 different layers. So, one is a primary emotion where, especially in childhood, before we had the defenses, we just felt our emotions raw, and they're like electric shocks, and they're so overwhelming for such small bodies. And so that's a primary emotion. It's usually a vulnerable emotion, or it's some sort of like unworthiness. I guess that would be vulnerable, like shame, powerlessness, lack, loneliness. But then I learned, oh, like I'm not allowed to have those emotions
Mhm.
in my family or in society. I get beat up on the playground if I cry. So I'm going to just pretend to be tough. And I cover it up with defensive emotions like anger, or I tense up my body. I freeze up to help push down the emotional experience of the primary vulnerable emotions. That tension, that secondary freeze response, that secondary contraction, that's also somatic ego. Maybe I'll talk to Ryan about if we're going to differentiate between these two, but for now, we're using primary and secondary emotions. So when I notice that something happens in my life now as an adult and I notice I just tense up, it might feel like, yeah, I'm feeling a lot of stuff, but that might not really be my primary emotional experience. But this contraction is the fearful response that is wired to help me manage a primary emotion that I likely don't have capacity for. I especially didn't as a child if I wasn't taught how to emotionally self regulate. I wasn't co regulated with, which we really need as children. And so I continue to have those habits as I grow up and I'm an adult. And so we start catching those habits like, okay, I'm tensing up. And then you see, what if I relax just 10%? And you might start noticing primary emotions arising, often at the core of the body, head, throat, chest, stomach, but really they could be anywhere. And there are ways to release that, which we can go into later. I have a video about that, how to come out of the freeze response. But this contraction, this secondary emotional component of the somatic ego, it drains the energy of the body. The psychological ego uses the somatic ego to siphon energy up towards it to maintain the existence of the psychological ego. People who feel like they're overthinking a lot, I definitely am one of these people who has this history. And I have had so much chronic fatigue and adrenal fatigue in my life. And that's been a major factor for, I think, in my journey, how to manage my energy.
Mhm.
And so I've had this experience, but that's what the psychological ego is doing. At first, it helped us survive our childhood, and then it kind of becomes a parasite. So I'll pause here.
Yeah. No, that's great. And yeah, I remember listening to you talk about the secondary and primary, and that's so helpful as well, because I think that is so often the case where I know for me, like I hold a lot in my body, and it's like the contraction is there, and it's almost, as I've done more and more and more work and listening, it's like, oh, it's like a numb tension that's like trying to protect me from the outside world, but it's also protecting me from the primary emotions. And the more, I can, it's like I've had to go through the process of like deconditioning that psychological ego enough to then be with the really like you mentioned, the childhood development of that somatic ego where the big emotions came up and they weren't allowed for whatever reason. I couldn't even make sense of it, and it's just like the only way to like survive that moment is to like clamp down and contract. And so there's, this intense fear of these emotions coming up and then they're going to be overwhelming. They're going to be too much for whomever, myself. And so, yeah, there's like working through that contraction. Then it's like, oh, okay, there's fear. Oh, okay, there's sadness. Oh, okay, now the grief can start to like move because, there's the sadness from 30 years ago, but there's the sadness of having to hold on to this sadness as well. And it feels like the longer we hold it, the fear of how overwhelming that's going to be to feel can also build. And I think what's really interesting too, going into like Taoism and a lot of the stuff, surrender, surrender, present moment, back to the breath, um, we can start to non-do a lot. But then there's the unconscious efforting, which is another form of doing it, that contraction that like drains so much energy. And that is like, to me, anyways, it's been so much more tricky and subtle because there's no three-step plan. There's no do this, 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 like how the mind likes to solve a problem. There's this total unknown territory. And it's like, I envision it as like a lake or a river. And it's like the only way into that is to feel into that. And it's like, I almost imagine like, we have the mind and the psychological ego and I would say like our heart. It's like the awareness has to come down into my heart to be with the somatic ego and body. If I am trying to be with my body from my mind or the ego, it doesn't work and it's really uncomfortable. It's like the awareness has to come down. And I think I've heard so many teachers as well talk about like bring your mind into your body. And I think I got like confused at what that actually meant as well, as opposed to like to me, awareness makes more sense. So I'm curious to kind of hear your thoughts on that as well.
Yeah. So, my teacher, Ryan, has taught me about the mind being the source of attention. And it's not um, necessarily the same as this consciousness. So we can talk about these terms in so many different levels and they
Hmm.
point to slightly different things, but to simplify it, I'll say I agree with you about like the attention coming into the body, but in the paradigm that he's taught me, the attention is coming from mind through this, tool we've been given, but it's like the higher mind rather than like the part of the mind that would be ruminative or ego mind, right? So it's
Hmm.
just okay, that's where the attention is. But there's really no localized attention or awareness. Like the people who are familiar with non-duality will say, yeah, but it's not coming from behind your eyes. It's not coming
Hmm.
from behind, and it's not. So
Hmm.
um, this gets maybe a bit complex, but I think it's useful to use whatever pointer works for someone where they can just bring their attention and awareness out of paying attention to mental activity and for the mind to just be the perceiver rather
Hmm.
than the one analyzing something or creating in this moment. It can just be the one that's perceiving
Hmm.
simply what is in this present moment. And that's sensation, because sensation is always happening in the present moment, or sensory experiences. It could be what you can see, what you can hear, what you can taste, what you can smell. It's always happening in the present. So placing the mind's attention away from ego and onto sensory perceptions can help pull us into the now and help us identify and feel through our emotions.
Mhm. Yeah, I think that makes sense as well. And yeah, it's interesting hearing, different people's like, oh, it doesn't come from here, it does come from here, because I think again, like everyone's individual, makeup is is slightly different. And so everyone's experiences are 100% different in a way. And so it's always going to have like a little bit different flavor for each person. And like, a word to somebody is going to mean slightly different than a word to somebody else too. So it's really interesting to just like keep in mind all of that stuff and, you know, see what lands and what doesn't. Because like, yeah, it's the same experience, but me thinking mind is attached more to like a up here.
Right.
And I don't know if you've ever heard of the Gene Keys and Richard Rudd, but he's really quite an interesting teacher as well. And he talks about how, often like the third eye is, talked about up here on our between our other eyes and our forehead. And he's kind of saying it's more down here. Like our heart
Hmm.
is more like our true third eye. And for me, it's like I feel like when I'm seeing with my heart or seeing as my heart, feeling as my heart. It is just that pure, observational, compassionate, like everything is allowed. There's no judgment, there's no desire. It's just like open arms, like this is happening. Beautiful.
Yes. Yeah. Oh, yeah. That's very beautiful. Definitely. It depends on where the pointer, or where the word is pointing to and where the person is at.